Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Behavior Bites. We are so thrilled that you decided to join us today. My name is Dr. Nikole Hollins-Sims. I'm an educational consultant for the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network out of our Harrisburg office and serve as the co-statewide lead for the Behavior Initiative. And I'm excited to have my colleague with me today who will introduce himself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bob Shields. I'm also an educational consultant out of the Pittsburgh Patent Office. I serve on the MTSS, Behavior, and Math initiatives.
Thanks, Bob. The Patent Behavior team is pleased to welcome Dr. Ambra Green from the University of Texas at Arlington to our episode of Behavior Bites today. Dr. Green is a national scholar with publications and research focused on students of color with and at risk for disabilities, issues related to inequitable school practices experienced by students of color, behavior disorders, positive behavior interventions and supports, and teacher use of evidence-based practices. Dr. Green, welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you. So we just have a few questions for you and just really want to tap into your expertise today. So as someone who has conducted research and has supported educators in the field, when you hear the term equity, what does that mean for you? And especially as it relates to supporting positive school climates and behavior.
When I hear the word equity, I get excited, first of all. It gives me hope also. So to me, it means that theoretically, our students who have been historically marginalized will be able to get the access to and effective implementation of evidence-based practices and individualized services. And particularly, it also means that Black students, who are arguably those students who receive the most detrimental of outcomes in terms of educational and post-secondary disparities compared to any other racial or ethnic group, will be supported by a group of stakeholders, so that could be teachers, school psychologists, social workers, who will scrutinize the current systems that continue to oppress these students and challenge the status quo. In schools and in districts, we have a ways to go, but I think we're finally at a point where many educators are beginning to realize that gone are the days when equality as a focus is acceptable. We are past that now in education, and many schools are implementing frameworks and practices that assist them in ensuring equity is at the foundational level. So I get excited and I am hopeful for the future.
Thank you. That really helps us to really frame out what equity could and should look like, particularly as we think about disproportionality.
Right.
And Dr. Green, particularly in these times, when we are considering and thinking about the challenges educators face, when we're discussing the concept of equity, in particular around behavior, what are some of the larger challenges we're facing?
You know, if I think of one of my biggest challenges as I am conducting research or as I am consulting with schools or school districts, one of the biggest challenges has been assisting schools and districts in transferring equity as a theory into equity as a practice. Educators tend to be more resistant when I argue that equity should be at the tier 1 or universal level of support, whether it be instructionally or in disciplinary practices. But often that resistance comes from a mindset or a perspective of equality and fairness, along with comments about students perceiving some things or may perceive some things as unfair. So when I get these rebuttals, regarding equity should be at the tier 1 level due to such a perspective, I typically engage the educator in a conversation about what we think students are and are not capable of understanding or being able to handle. We often think that students can't handle or that they don't understand the concept of equity, and or equity as in the idea that everyone or every student will get what they need. And I don't think that we've even sought to try to teach equity explicitly to students. And so that may be where an area of disconnect lies. And so I also talked to the educators about what would happen if we begin the school year teaching about equity and laying the foundation that in our classroom or in our school building or in the district this year, equity is going to just be the way that we operate. That's going to be the norm. So everyone will always get what they need, and what they need may not be the same thing that their neighbor needs or that their neighbor has, but your needs will always be met in the classroom. This could also be true for how an educator or an administrator delivers consequences for undesired behaviors. So for example, a school that I consult with made a decision to assign 2 different consequences to 2 different students that were involved in the same behavioral incident. And the behavioral incident was the students had drugs on campus. And the consequence for one student was a few days of in-school suspension. The consequence for the second student was not suspension at all, but instead a mandatory bi-weekly after-school attendance in an alcohol and drug dependency treatment center. And the leadership team had to really wrestle with equity in practice, right? They theorized equity, but they had to think about it in practice. And so they arrived at these different consequences based on the functions of the student's behavior, the record of behavioral infractions regarding the same incident, but also their behavioral meeting with the student that provided more details into the students and their behaviors. So examples like these are when educators tend to have the most trouble translating their theory of equity into practice. And so that has been most challenging, but it is necessary work and it's needed work. And if we really want to see, equity live in our schools, then we have to be able to put it into practice.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Green, one of the things that you just highlighted that resonated with me was this concept of differentiating consequences and how that can be a part of your framework when implementing PBIS.
Absolutely.
Most recently, there's been a lot of pushback, though, on frameworks like PBIS and social emotional learning, where people see those frameworks as somewhat oppressive. As someone who understands PBIS and knows the ins and outs of systems, data, and practices, what would you say in response to those criticisms?
You're right. There are a lot of criticisms around these frameworks. However, it's in my opinion that these frameworks in and of themselves are not, and they do not intend to perpetuate oppressive systems. In general, systems are made up of practices and procedures that are developed and implemented by people, by real individuals. And in the development and implementation is where oppression can be perpetuated. So neither of these frameworks, though, give a script, nor do they give a curriculum or a list of practices or a list of procedures for which individuals are to implement. Rather, these frameworks provide theoretical foundations for actions. They provide guidelines and frameworks for which to work within. So then it is up to individuals or to people, the school leader, an educator, the leadership team, to develop their own practices and procedures to implement within these frameworks. So if we think about, or if we know anything about educators working in schools, and we know the current research regarding educator perspectives on students based on race, ethnicity, culture, language, ability, or disability. Again, we know that there's still a lot of work to be done with regards to fostering these paradigm shifts away from bias, away from racism and differential treatment, as you mentioned. So the way I think about it is, and try to explain and defend is, if a system is made up of practices and procedures implemented by people who do not hold an equity lens or an equity perspective, then the issue becomes who is on the team that's developing these practices and procedures for the schools to implement. This is where the system, or any system in general, has the potential to be oppressive. So that's why it's important that our teams, our leadership teams, the PBIS team, SEL team, the school teams or district teams, that are creating the systems that work within these types of frameworks are diverse, and they're representative of the student population and the community in which the school or the district is in. And it's important that these schools maintain ongoing professional learning in their calendar of events so that they are able to consistently engage in conversations about equity and cultural responsiveness so that we don't perseverate these oppressive systems within larger frameworks like PBIS and SEL.
Thank you. I think that's really helpful for our viewers because as you know, there's a lot of discussion about this. So to hear you really break that down, it's really appreciated. Thank you.
Of course.
And I think that's a great segue into the next question regarding a piece of advice. If you could synthesize that down into one piece of advice for people who are new into this work, they're newly engaging with disproportionality, with the data that's there. What would the one or two key pieces of advice to you be to them as they embark and embrace this?
Yeah, that's a good question. One piece of advice is that school teams or individuals should realize that disproportionality is in disciplinary practices or in general is multifaceted. It's a multifaceted issue. And so to begin to address these issues of disproportionality, teams have to be willing to critically look at the issue from multiple perspectives with multiple stakeholders. A lot of schools or schools that I've worked with establish an equity team, and this team can be helpful in beginning to help the school or district look critically at ways to address issues of inequity. And that's a good place to start. You don't want to stay there with an equity team because we don't want to work in silos. Everyone should have the understanding and come from the framework or foundation of equity so that when we're on these leadership teams, it's just the way that we think. So looking critically, and another one would just be to stay abreast of the leading research in the areas of discipline and disproportionality through conferences, through practitioner journal articles and such. Although the issue of disproportionality is not new, the interventions and the research base as far as how to decrease disproportionality is fairly new and it's evolving. So you want to make sure that you are staying abreast of the current evidence-based research that's happening.
Thank you for that. Those great tips. Much appreciated. As we close out here, just to yield the floor to you, are there any closing remarks or thoughts you'd like to share with our viewers here today?
Sure. As we think about the current situation that we find ourselves in all over the globe, right? Our current pandemic certainly helped to expose the educational gaps that have already been there in our systems, that are inherent in our school systems across the nation between marginalized groups and their students and their peers. So my words of advice or things that I'd like to leave with the audience is to start now and consider what you're going to do about the gaps that you may not have been aware of that were brought to light with COVID-19. Consider what you've learned that is most important and what you've learned that you thought was important, but really isn't when we're thinking about educating, students. Some things that we were focused on when we were face-to-face, we're not able to focus on that now, right? And so what is really important, and take that back with you into our next season of how we are going to educate. And then, right now you have the ability to revise the way that you teach, the way that you discipline, which really means to teach, or to support students. So, determine your areas of focus and how you're going to be an advocate and an example for equitable practices and a champion for equity. I
love it. One of my favorite phrases is to be an equity champion. So you just we're validating each other in this moment. So thank you so much for that. I want to personally, again, thank you, Dr. Green, for the time that you spent with us today. Just, again, sharing your amazing expertise. I saw you on Twitter and have been following you. And so hopefully at the end of this, we'll be able to put your Twitter handle out so that people can have access to you even more. For our viewers, just so you know, please feel free to always visit our patent website at www.pattan.net, where you can visit our Behavior Initiative webpage and get resources and information like the fabulous Dr. Green. And please remember that today's session was a bite of behavior, and we will see you next time. Take care.